me today on the Israel Connection, coming to you on JA Community Radio in Melbourne, Australia, is Professor Emeritus Alan Dershowitz, who requires no introduction, and we'll be discussing the judicial reforms that have been tabled by the new Israeli government. Welcome indeed to you, Professor Dershowitz.
Thank you so much for having me. I love Australia. I've had some of my best times there, and I love the Jewish community in Australia. I've spoken to them on many occasions.
And I really appreciate that you've invited me into your study today. It's really an honor indeed, even though it's only virtual. Now, you've said that the Israel Supreme Court should have its power constrained to not deal with political or economic issues. You've also suggested that the Knesset override rule could or should be toughened to require a large majority of the Knesset if it's going to be invoked. Now, are these the only changes you see as being required to the operation of the judiciary in Israel?
Well, I think that the Supreme Court of Israel has been Israel's iron dome, legal iron dome, against attacks from international courts. It's the most highly regarded Supreme Court in the world, including the United States Supreme Court. Its justices' opinions are quoted all over Europe and all over the world. It's a great institution. Maybe it's gone too far in some areas. I think it has. I don't think it should determine who can serve in the government, like Aryeh Dyer. That doesn't seem appropriate. I don't think it should decide whether the gas deal with Lebanon is reasonable or not. I don't approve of it making decisions on political or economic grounds. My point is, and it only is this: when it comes to decisions on basic human rights, basic civil liberties, minority rights, due process, free speech, those areas are so sacrosanct that the Israeli Supreme Court should have the last word, and the Knesset should not be able to override it. Or if it does, it should be by a 2/3 vote or an 80% vote to make sure it's multi-partisan, not just a partisan attack on a particular decision of the Supreme Court. So I think there is room for compromise. But right now, both sides are engaged in extremism, and they're not willing to compromise. Both sides want everything, and that's not going to be a good result. The good result is to rationally compromise, to curtail some of the power of the Supreme Court, but keep it intact for the most important issues.
Well, I believe there might be some willingness on behalf of the Justice Minister, Levin, to consult with the head of the High Court once all these laws or legislation are on the table from the Knesset. So it's not going to be totally putting it through without any consideration of how the other side feels about it.
I hope so, but the sides are becoming fairly rigid and fairly fixed. When I was in Israel just recently, I spent time with the Prime Minister of Israel, my old friend Benjamin Netanyahu, who I've known for 50 years, and we had a fundamental disagreement. But he talked about balance. He used it 6 times in our discussion: balance, balance. And what I'm proposing is balance. I also spoke to the Attorney General. I also spoke to 2 of the former presidents of the Supreme Court and many others who are deeply involved on both sides of the issue. And I would certainly be happy to offer my services to try to suggest some middle ground that will satisfy the basic opposition to the Supreme Court power, but at the same time preserve its important role as a defender of due process, free speech, equal protection, and minority rights.
Yeah, well, we hope it's going to go along those lines. Also, I understand that according to the minister's plan to severely limit the High Court of Justice's oversight of Parliament, the suggestion is also the court should only be able to strike down laws passed by the Knesset when the support in the court is actually 12 out of its 15 justices.
Well, that's the equivalent of saying they should have no power, especially since the current government wants to have politicians have a major role in selecting justices. So if the politicians have a major role in selecting justices, and you need a supermajority of justices, it will simply never happen. It's a cover. I think what's happening now, except at the extremes, is not broken, and we shouldn't break it.
Right, okay. Now, the Israeli Supreme Court believes it can overrule any legislation that it claims has constitutional status, but is not the claim of the court that certain laws have constitutional status not really valid anyway, as there's no constitutional framework in Israel?
Well, there is a constitutional framework, just as there is in Great Britain. Great Britain does not have a written constitution, and when obviously Australia was under the control of Great Britain, it also didn't, for ultimate issues, have a written constitution. But Britain has a very long history of constitutional law. I know I've lectured in classes in Britain on constitutional law, and I've also lectured in Israel on constitutional law. I taught a course with Aaron Barak, the then president of the Supreme Court, Erwin Cutler, the then Minister of Justice of Canada, and myself at Harvard Law School on comparative constitutional law between a country with an old constitution, the United States, a new constitution, Canada, and no written constitution, Israel. And the results were relatively similar, more similar than they were different. So Israel does have a constitution, it just doesn't have a written constitution.
When you say as a constitution, in what form is that? Are you referring to the basic laws?
Well, no, I think the basic law is the tradition and precedent. Give you an example. Member of the government, Ben-Gvir, has said that he would propose allowing different rules of engagement for rock throwers, depending on whether they were Palestinians or Jews. That would be struck down by any court in the world. It's bigoted and racist and wrong and unconstitutional. Israel court would have no problem looking at the history of Israel, the traditions of Israel, the Declaration of Independence, which talks about equality for all citizens, and historical precedents, and strike it down as it should strike it down. There should be no override for that. Even if every single member of parliament thinks it's okay to shoot Palestinians on less of a basis than shooting Jews, the court should not allow that. There are areas that are sacred, and that's one of them. You know, the Torah says, lo takir panim. It instructs judges not to recognize faces, which means races, which means genders, which means political ideologies. You have to be blind. That's where the blindfolded justice comes from. It's not from Greek mythology. It's from Devarim, Parshat Shoftim, in which Hashem instructs his judges, lo takir panim, do not recognize faces. But Ben-Gvir would want the courts to recognize faces and make a difference based on whether the faces are Palestinian or Jewish. That's wrong.
Yeah, I mean, I would use the word unprincipled rather than unconstitutional in my own language. Now, according to yes,
court should have power to strike things down as unprincipled. Yeah. Although I've written a book called The Price of Principle, and I strongly believe in principle, I don't see that as a criteria for striking down opinions any more than I see reasonableness. I think the criteria have to be firmer and clearer and more objective.
So I think you've anticipated one of my questions that I've got shortly, because you just mentioned the word reasonableness, because I'm going to ask you whether you believe that the doctrine of reasonableness is a basis for assessing legislation, that if that's reasonable.
I don't believe it is. I think it's too subjective and too vague and too subject to multiple interpretations. Now, the court has done a good job in applying reasonableness. They also have other concepts like dignity, the dignity of the person. Those, to me, are not appropriate bases for striking down legislation. I would have a clear, firm basis in history and in law, and not permit striking down simply on reasonableness or dignity or any other vague criteria, which we will all agree to in our personal lives, is the way we should conduct our lives. We should treat everybody reasonably. We should treat everybody with dignity, but that's not a proper criteria for the court. So I come down squarely halfway between both sides on this issue. I am not in favor of keeping the status quo exactly. I would be in favor of making some changes, but I am totally against giving the Knesset the power to overrule Supreme Court decisions on fundamental basic human rights.
So also, if the Knesset debates a piece of legislation and makes a decision, the court can also not block it by saying that they didn't spend enough time on considering it, as
Well,
happened.
that's interesting. The United States Supreme Court has had a few cases like that. I think that's more of a due process claim. If the legislation is rushed through without any opportunity for the other side, let me give you an example. In the United States, we recently had the January 6th Commission to look into Donald Trump's behavior on the day that the invasion of the Capitol occurred. That was a violation of due process. Nobody on the commission was on Trump's side or supported his point of view. I'm not on Trump's side. I opposed that. I think what happened on January 6th was wrong. I think the election was fair. But there should have been an opportunity for the other side to present its arguments. And I can imagine a court saying, no, any conclusions made so rapidly. There's a story in the Talmud that said if the Sanhedrin delivered a death penalty on the same day of the argument without sleeping on it overnight, the courts said that would be an invalid judgment. So, for those of you who are very conservative and are opposed to the current Supreme Court and are also very religious, look at the Torah, look at the Talmud, and you'll get a lot of interesting concepts that disagree with you. Lo takir ponim is one of them. The way in which the Sanhedrin operated was another. I don't believe that Israel should be governed by Jewish law. I don't believe it should ever become a theocracy. But because it's the nation state of the Jewish people, I think it's perfectly okay to look to Jewish sources as one among many guides. And I think many jurisprudence philosophies would tell you that you need to have fair deliberation, not rushing things through. So there, I would not be in favor of an override.
Okay. So according to Levin's proposals, Supreme Court justices will no longer have veto power over who is appointed to the bench by the Judicial Selection Committee. Now, under the report proposal,
they don't have veto power today. The committee is 9 people. It's a terrific committee. It's a wonderful committee. It's a much better way of picking judges than they have in either the United States or Great Britain. I wish I were more familiar with the Australian way, but it consists of a majority of professionals, that is, judges and members of the bar, and 4 are members of the Knesset. So Supreme Court justices don't have a veto. You still need to get the agreement of members of the bar, and Supreme Court justices often don't agree with each other. I mean, I've seen arguments in the Supreme Court. They argue like children with each other. They disagree. They're dissenting opinions. So I think that's a myth to say that it gives the justices of the Supreme Court a complete veto. That's just not true.
So in this regard, Levin has declared that there'll no longer be a situation whereby judges choose themselves in back rooms with no protocol. You don't agree with his point of view on that either, I guess.
Well, I certainly don't want it to be picked in back rooms by politicians negotiating and bargaining the way Benjamin Netanyahu, to his credit, had to bargain to form a government. No, I don't want back room. I want everything transparent. I want the negotiations of the Judicial Commission, the 9 people, I want them to be public. I want them to be transparent. If they want to have hearings, they should have hearings. But I don't want to substitute what they call one back room for another back room.
According to what I understand, currently the 3 judges on the panel essentially hold a veto, as at least one of their votes is required to approve a candidate in the selection process for the High Court. So isn't that, in a sense, a form of veto?
Well, but it's a good thing because it means you don't get on the Supreme Court unless you have the approval of justices of the Supreme Court. That's, I think, a good thing. The government can then propose other people. And if you want to change that, let's debate that. And let's debate eliminating the one justice veto. That's reasonable, but I wouldn't change the whole system. And under no circumstances would I give a majority vote in the committee to the Knesset. It would turn them into in the United States, where our process of selecting judges is an abomination. It's totally political, and it's partisan. And every time there's a new president, the court shifts its political views. They overrule decisions that are 50 years old, like Roe versus Wade, just because they can, just because there are enough justices appointed. So don't borrow the bad parts of the American system, borrow the good parts. Checks and balances, separation of powers, those are good attributes, but not the way in which we select judges. There's very few worse systems. No, I'm sure the Kremlin is worse, and I'm sure the Ayatollahs are worse. But among Western democracies, I would not hold up the American model as one to be emulated.
Yeah, the contrary opinion here is that allowing sitting judges to choose their own successors is a bad idea. It's a bit of it amounts to nepotism in a sense.
Well, nepotism doesn't. I mean, you can't appoint people who are related to you, so it doesn't really apply nepotism. But it does say that you want professional approval. You want people who know lawyers and who pick them on their qualifications rather than on how they're going to vote. I think that makes some sense. But I'm happy to debate and discuss whether to eliminate the veto of one justice. That seems like it's not an unreasonable idea, as long as the professionals still have 5 votes to the politicians' 4 votes. I think that's important.
So I suppose you concur that in Israel's case in particular, because it doesn't have a house of review in its parliament like we have in Australia, America has, Britain has, the High Court takes on a much more important role in Israel than these other countries.
No, I wouldn't say that. I would say the United States takes on as much of a role. I think you're right about Australia and England, but I think the United States Supreme Court is extremely powerful, and it can't be overruled by the House or the Senate. It can only be overruled by constitutional amendment. So I would say both the Supreme Court of the United States and of Israel are very powerful in different ways.
Is it appropriate that the Supreme Court can have jurisdiction over who is entitled to sit in the Knesset or be a minister?
That's a mistake. I don't think it should ever be the power of the Supreme Court to do that. And if the Supreme Court does have the power, it should be able to be overridden. So I'm in favor of overriding Supreme Court decisions about who can serve in the government. I don't think that's an appropriate role for the Supreme Court to serve.
So we just saw the leader of Shas, Aryeh Deri, in a vote of 10-1 in the court, saying that he didn't really have a right to sit in the Knesset as a minister because of his previous convictions. Was that inappropriate for the court to have made any kind of judgment on that?
Yes, it was. I think it was. I think the parliament should pass laws as to who's qualified, and they should make the decision about whether a person who's sentenced to prison but hasn't served a sentence can qualify. It should be up to the legislature, and I don't think the Supreme Court could intervene unless it's unconstitutional. For example, if they say no Orthodox Jew can serve in the government, of course that's illegal. If they say no Arab can serve in the government, of course that would be illegal. But if they say that nobody who's been convicted and served a sentence can serve in the government, that would be perfectly lawful.
Now, your prime concern, Professor Dershowitz, is that the proposed judicial reforms are a threat to civil liberties and minorities. Can you please cite some specific examples where the High Court has in fact been a great defender of minority rights?
Oh, do you have about an hour or two? I can go over the very
one or two examples would be just fantastic.
Of striking highlights. One, the Supreme Court of Israel outlawed torture of terrorists who might have information. They created exception for the ticking bomb case in certain circumstances, but they struck down the general procedure of the Shin Bet, which involved extreme measures that some people called torture. That was a very important decision. It's been cited all over the world. It's been taught all over the world in universities. The other one would be what was known as the neighbors policy, when the Israeli Defense Forces would, if they wanted to go into a house where there were some terrorists, they would hold a Palestinian in front of them as they walked in and essentially tell the terrorists, if you want to shoot an Israeli soldier, you're going to have to kill one of your Palestinians first. And the Supreme Court of Israel said no to that. The Supreme Court of Israel also said, no, you can't hold a civilian hostage in order to exchange that civilian for civilians that are held hostage by the enemy. That's three of hundreds. In the course I taught with Barak and with Professor Cutler, we went over dozens of such cases. And it turns out that the Supreme Court of Israel, Canada, and the United States came to relatively similar conclusions on many of those cases. But there's no doubt that the Supreme Court has served to protect free speech, civil liberties, and the rights of minorities, and it should continue to do so.
So when we just started talking in this interview, you said that the reasons you don't, the basis on which the court shouldn't make decisions shouldn't be political or economic. Now, right. Some might argue that issues of Israeli security also shouldn't be dealt with by the High Court. That really the army, the IDF, really should be concerned about that and accountable to the legislator for that. You don't agree with that? You think that they should be dictating to the security forces how they should be running the show in Israel?
No, they shouldn't be dictating anything to the security forces. And in most cases, they have allowed the security forces to do what they have to do. But in extreme cases, they've said this goes too far. And among the people who are most strongly opposed to these changes are either former or current heads of the military and heads of the Shin Bet and heads of the Mossad. They don't think that the power of the Israeli Supreme Court, some may, but many don't. So I do think that the Supreme Court of Israel has appropriately balanced security concerns against basic civil liberties and human rights, and has come to the right decision in most cases. I disagreed with the decision on the neighbors policy. I thought it was perfectly reasonable for Israeli soldiers to hold the Palestinian as a shield, but the Supreme Court disagreed with me, and I don't think they were wrong. I just thought that there should be more discretion given to people in combat whose lives are at stake. Reasonable people could disagree or agree with that, but the military is not among those who's pushing hard for the override.
Now, in a podcast with Mark Levin on Levin TV, Professor Eugene Kontorovich explained that the current arrangement in Israel is a result of the judicial revolution that was announced by the Supreme Court in the 1990s under Aaron Barak. It's much more like an autocracy, according to him, much more like a tyranny, in that some of the most important decisions in the country, including potentially even who can be prime minister, are made by a group of self-selecting judges with absolutely no check on them and no possibility for correcting any of the errors over time through democratic or popular processes. It's not really a court, he continued. It's essentially a supreme legislative chamber not picked by the people, which exercises total power over anything the government or the legislature might do. These reforms would simply make Israel function more like a democracy in which there is some political input, in which the people have some say in the fundamental decisions governing them. What do you make of these remarks from Professor Kontorovich?
Well, first, I have respect for him. He's a very eminent professor, but I think he is unwilling, or at least at the moment seems unwilling, to compromise. His arguments go too far. He should argue that they shouldn't pick the prime minister. I would agree with that. He should argue that they shouldn't decide who can serve in the government. I agree with that. But he doesn't address the issue of what about human rights and basic civil liberties. So what I think is the extremes on both sides are passing like ships in the night. They are not addressing each other's concerns. And I would love to debate Professor Kontorovich. I think we could come to some common ground and agree on more things and disagree on some others. But I don't think extremism on either side is in the interests of the Israeli people.
Would you be interested in reaching out to him to do just that?
I don't think I have his contact information, but I'm happy to debate him if somebody else could arrange it.
Well, I'll speak to the Gehelit Policy Forum and see if he's interested. That would be a fantastic encounter, I think, if that could happen.
Yep.
I don't think you've listened to a short excerpt of remarks that Professor Kontorovich made about the role in particular of the Attorney General in Israel, a role that you in America and me in Australia would find to be quite extraordinary. You haven't listened to that, have you? I think
a position is, in the Israeli government, not only does the Attorney General have power, but so, for example, does the Judge Advocate General. Israel is one of the only countries in which the Judge Advocate General can tell the Israeli army that they can't do certain things. It's not just advisory as it is in the United States, and I think it's worked quite well. Again, there are issues that call out for compromise. I think it's certainly possible that the Attorney General's power is too extensive, but don't throw out the baby with the bathwater. Don't throw out the entire process, and that's what the people on the right are trying to do. Look, let's be very clear. The people on the right don't like the results the Supreme Court has reached because they're not supportive of right-wing values. If the shoe were on the other foot, if the Supreme Court had just as much power and just as much influence, but was ruling repeatedly for the right, these folks would not be calling for the change. The same thing is true in America. The same people who want a change in the United States are doing it only because they don't like the results. For example, after Roe versus Wade, the left decided it wanted to pack the Supreme Court, term limits, age limits, only because they didn't like the results. So I don't think this is a debate about process or institutions. It's much more a debate about whether you like the results of the Supreme Court. And I would like to see it move back more to a debate over principles, over whether or not this is consistent with principles of civil liberties and the rule of law. And I think we can have a serious and interesting debate on that as long as we don't necessarily stick to the extreme views that both sides now seem to be adhering to.
Well, I suppose it wouldn't be fair for me to really intersperse this interview segment with Professor Kontorovich if you haven't really heard it. So I won't do that after I finish this interview with you, Alan. That wouldn't be really the because you really haven't responded exactly to what he says in that. But have a listen to that at some point when you have time.
I have respect for him. He's a very good teacher and an eminent constitutional lawyer. I just don't agree with him on this issue. I probably agree with him on some aspects of the issue, but I think he's taken it much too far.
Now, just to finish up with, Israel is constantly harassed, as we both know, by the international courts like the ICC and the ICJ. Now, should Israel really be fearing retribution from these courts that are fundamentally anti-Israel anyway and will use anything that Israel does to condemn it?
I can give you personal experiences on that. I went to The Hague in order to argue against The Hague having jurisdiction over Israel under the principles of complementarity. And I think I helped to persuade the original prosecutor at the International Criminal Court that Israel's legal system satisfies the notion of complementarity, and the International Court of Justice did not accept jurisdiction over Israel. I think that would be a much harder argument today to make. I don't know whether I'd succeed in making it. By the way, I'll still make it. And I'm going to support Israel no matter what. Even if all of these reforms are done, Israel will still be the most democratic, most law-abiding country that operates under the rule of law. So even if everything that I disapprove of happens, I will continue to defend Israel. I'm not a fair weather friend. And I will go to international courts and defend them. I will defend them on college campuses. I might disagree with some of the things, but I will always continue to defend Israel, the nation state of the Jewish people, as it approaches its 75th year. No country in history has ever done more for humankind in 75 years than Israel. No country in history facing threats similar to those faced by Israel from Iran, from terrorism, Hezbollah, Hamas, has ever had a better record of human rights, due process, civil liberties, concern for enemy civilians, and the rule of law. So I'm a proud Zionist, and I'm going to continue to defend Israel, though I am going to continue to criticize, as I continue to criticize the United States, when I think it violates principles that are very important.
Well, I certainly concur with what you were saying just then, and I really appreciate you giving me the case that you believe is for having some consideration about these judicial reforms, making sure that they don't go through wholesale. You've come on today to speak to me following a little segment I did last week with Dr. Martin Sherman, who is strongly for the judicial reforms. So in order to provide balance on my program, I've taken the step to speak to you, and actually later on today I'll speak to Orly Lidikovsky, who's the executive director, I think, of the Israel Religious Action Center, who's been out there campaigning very, very strongly to amongst the diaspora, even to make sure that these reforms are not carried.
I want to make one point about that. There is great debate in the United States about judicial reform. Nobody in the world cares about it. It's a domestic issue. Let the Americans decide it. There were great debates in many countries. Why does the world have to butt in every time Israel is trying to make a domestic issue? Why does every domestic issue in Israel become internationalized? Why does it always become about Israel's right to exist? I don't agree with that. My good friend Abe Foxman made a mistake when he told Haaretz, if these reforms are passed, I'm not sure I'll be able to support Israel. No. You continue to support Israel. You may disagree with some of its policies, but I'm very opposed to the internationalization. This is an issue of domestic concern to Israel and world organizations. The German people, the French people, the British people, the Australian people, the American people ought to butt their nose out of the business. Let Israel do its business and stop making it an international issue. It's not. It's a domestic issue.
Yes, the scrutiny that Israel faces is quite extraordinary, as we both understand.
Wrong.
Yes. Look, I thank you once again, Professor Dershowitz, for speaking to me on the Israel Connection. It's been most enjoyable from my point of view.
And mine. Thank you so much. Be well.